I am Tessa, 27 years old, and I spent my entire life trying to be good enough for a family that saw me as a permanent stain on their perfect reputation. The final straw came during a freezing night in Malibu when my father threw two cheap sleeping bags on a marble floor for me and my 7-year-old daughter. He told us my sister's husband needed the guest room for his dogs. I did not cry or argue. I just packed our bags and walked out into the storm. What they did not know was that I was the CEO of the luxury estate company running that $15 million property, and by the time I started my engine, I had charged my father's credit card for every single penny of his stay. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. The rain lashed violently against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the $15 million Malibu rental estate. Inside the massive foyer was freezing. My father Thomas stood over me with a look of absolute disdain as he violently tossed two cheap thin sleeping bags directly at my feet. They landed on the imported Italian marble with a pathetic thud. Beside me, my 7-year-old daughter Abby shivered in her thin sweater, her small hands gripping the hem of my jacket. I looked up at my father, waiting for the punchline of a very cruel joke, but his face remained stone cold. "Your sister and her husband require the master suite," Thomas declared, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive cashmere cardigan. "And Elijah's two French bulldogs will be taking the guest room. The hardwood floor hurts their purebred joints. You and the kid can sleep here in the foyer. It builds character." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of his words. "You want your granddaughter to sleep on a freezing marble floor so some dogs can have a memory foam mattress?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level so I would not scare Abby. My mother, Caroline, sighed loudly from the top of the grand staircase. She descended gracefully, a vision of carefully preserved suburban wealth. "Stop being so dramatic, Tessa," she scolded, not even glancing at her shivering granddaughter. "You have been used to roughing it since you got pregnant at 20 and shamed this entire family. A little cold floor will not hurt you. You should be grateful your father even allowed you to tag along on his dime." A harsh laugh echoed through the cavernous room. I turned to see my older sister Alyssa strolling into the foyer with a glass of vintage champagne in her hand. She leaned affectionately against her husband Elijah, a tall, impeccably dressed African-American venture capitalist who made sure his custom Rolex caught the light every time he moved his arm. Elijah smirked, looking down at me and Abby, as if we were pests that had wandered in from the street. "You really should have booked a hotel, Tessa," Alyssa mocked, taking a slow sip of her champagne. "But I guess high school dropouts working low-wage customer service jobs cannot exactly afford Malibu in the winter. You are lucky Dad is so generous. Otherwise, you and your little mistake would be spending the holidays in some dingy motel back home." Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, babe, leave her alone. It is not her fault she lacks the drive to succeed. Not everyone can handle the pressure of the real world. Let the dogs have the room. I paid $10,000 for those pups. They need their rest." For 7 years, I had swallowed my pride. For 7 years, I had endured their endless snide remarks, their constant comparisons, and their deliberate attempts to make me feel small. I had let them believe their own narrative that I was the tragic, broken daughter who ruined her life, while Alyssa was the golden child who married a wealthy crypto genius. I had attended their dinners, bought their gifts, and smiled through their insults, desperately hoping that one day they would look at me and Abby with genuine love. But looking at my daughter kneeling on that freezing marble floor while her own grandfather prioritized two dogs over her comfort, something inside me finally snapped. The desperate, approval-seeking girl I had been died right there in that beautiful freezing foyer. I did not cry. I did not yell. I did not try to explain that I was not a customer service rep, or that I had spent the last 7 years building an empire from the ground up, while they worried about country club gossip. I simply bent down, picked up the sleeping bags, and tossed them back at my father's feet. I helped Abby put her winter coat back on, buttoning it all the way up to her chin. "Pack your things, sweetie," I said, my voice eerily calm. "We are leaving." Alyssa rolled her eyes. Oh, please. Where are you going to go at midnight in a storm? You cannot even afford an Uber back to the airport. I ignored her, grabbing my duffel bag and taking Abby's hand. I walked right past my parents, opening the massive oak front door and stepping out into the freezing rain without a single backward glance. My father yelled something about me being ungrateful, but the howling wind drowned out his voice. I secured Abby in the back seat of my luxury SUV, wrapping her in a warm fleece blanket I kept in the trunk. Once she was safe and comfortable, I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. The rain beat against the windshield as I pulled my phone from my pocket. I did not open a banking app to check a meager balance, nor did I look for a cheap motel. Instead, I opened a highly secured administrative application on my phone. The screen loaded, displaying a sleek logo and the words, Lux Haven Estates Executive Portal. My family genuinely believed Thomas had paid for this breathtaking Malibu rental. They believed his logistics business was thriving and that he was treating us all to a lavish holiday. What they did not know, what they could not possibly comprehend, was that I was the founder and CEO of Lux Haven Estates. This property was part of my exclusive portfolio catering to the ultra-wealthy. I had personally comped the entire stay out of my own pocket, hoping to finally give my family a beautiful memory together. I navigated to the active reservations tab and pulled up my father's file. The total cost for the week, including the private chef, the VIP ski passes, and the estate rental itself, stood at $65,000. With a perfectly steady hand, I found the setting for his reservation. I tapped the button that removed the owner complimentary status and selected bill card on file. The system processed the request, instantly charging the full amount to the credit card Thomas had provided for incidentals. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the massive iron gates of the estate, leaving the toxic remnants of my past behind in the storm. The floor they tried to make me sleep on was cold, but the vengeance I was about to deliver would be absolute ice. 3 days had passed since I drove away from that Malibu estate. I was sitting in my ultra-modern corner office on the top floor of the Lux Haven building in downtown Boston. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow over my custom mahogany desk. I took a sip of my black coffee and watched the screen of my personal cell phone light up yet again. It had been lighting up continuously for 72 hours. The notification banner proudly displayed exactly 114 missed calls. The breakdown was entirely predictable. 40 calls were from my father Thomas. 50 calls were from my mother Caroline. The rest were a frantic barrage from my sister Alyssa. I had spent the weekend enjoying a peaceful life. While my family was dealing with the consequences of their arrogance, I had taken my daughter Abby to her favorite bakery in Beacon Hill. We bought pastries, visited the aquarium, and slept in a warm, comfortable bed. I had deliberately ignored the digital meltdown happening in my pocket. But now it was Monday morning. It was time to face the music. I tapped the voicemail icon and selected the most recent audio file from my father. His voice exploded through the phone speaker, completely stripped of its usual country club refinement. The audio was filled with the chaotic sounds of howling wind, driving rain, and honking car horns in the background. "Tessa, you spoiled, ungrateful brat!" Thomas screamed, his breath hitching with genuine rage. "What did you do to my reservation? My platinum card was just hit with a $65,000 charge, and the bank froze all my accounts for suspected fraudulent activity." I leaned back in my leather ergonomic chair, a slow, icy smile spreading across my face. He was not finished. He shouted over the noise of a passing transport truck. The estate security breached the master bedroom doors at 3 in the morning. They dragged us out of bed. They forced us out into the freezing rain in our pajamas. Elijah threatened to sue them, and the guards threatened to call the police and have us arrested for trespassing. We are standing on the side of the Pacific Coast Highway like common criminals. You better call whatever pathetic customer service manager you report to and fix this instantly, or I swear I will ruin you. The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I placed the phone back on my desk, feeling a profound sense of peace. For 27 years, my father had controlled our family through financial intimidation. He used his wealth to manipulate my mother to spoil Alyssa, and to constantly remind me of my exact place at the bottom of the hierarchy. Hearing him standing on the side of a highway completely powerless and exposed to the elements was a specific kind of justice I had never allowed myself to dream of. Before I could even process the satisfaction, my screen vibrated with a rapid succession of incoming text messages. They were from my mother. Her name flashed angrily across the digital display. Message 1 read, "You are a complete disgrace to this family." Message 2 read, "Elijah had to carry his expensive dogs through the mud because the guards would not let them walk on the driveway. Their paws are ruined." Message 3 read, "We had to walk 2 miles to a dirty gas station to wait for a taxi because your father's credit cards are completely locked. You need to call your managers right this second. Fix this glitch now. I mean it, Tessa." I picked up the phone. I thought about the 7 years I had spent building Lux Haven estates from nothing. I remembered the sleepless nights the grueling investor pitches, the sheer panic of risking everything I had to secure my first luxury property. My family never once asked how I survived. They never cared how I put food on the table for Abby. They simply assumed I was a massive failure because that was the convenient role they had assigned to me. I opened the keyboard. I did not type a long explanation. I did not justify my actions or apologize for their discomfort. I simply typed a response that I knew would shatter my mother's fragile sense of reality. No glitch. I typed, my thumbs moving deliberately over the glass screen. Dogs cost extra. Try an Uber. I hit send. The delivery receipt appeared instantly. I set the phone face down, flipped open my laptop, and went back to reviewing the quarterly revenue reports for my European properties. I assumed that would be the end of it for the day. I assumed they would spend the next few hours scrambling to find a cheap hotel room and booking economy flights back to Boston. I underestimated my sister's desperation for attention. Exactly 1 hour later, my secure office line rang. It was my vice president of public relations, Sarah. "Tessa," she said, her voice tight with professional urgency. "We have a rapidly escalating situation online. I just sent a link to your secure inbox. You need to see this immediately." I clicked the link she provided. It opened a TikTok video that was already climbing past 2 million views. There on my high-definition office monitor was my sister Alyssa. She was sitting in what looked like the lobby of a budget airport motel. Her designer clothes were visibly damp and wrinkled. Her perfect blowout was completely ruined by the California rain. She was clutching Elijah's 2 French bulldogs to her chest, her face streaked with heavy mascara tears. In the background, Elijah was pacing furiously, yelling at a motel receptionist. "Hey guys." Alyssa sniffled into the camera, utilizing her absolute best influencer victim voice. "I am so sorry to post something so negative, but my family is going through a literal nightmare right now. My sister Tessa is deeply unwell. She is a broke, jealous high school dropout who has always hated me and my husband." She paused to wipe a perfectly timed tear from her cheek, ensuring her diamond wedding ring caught the terrible fluorescent lighting of the lobby. "She somehow hacked into a luxury travel agency's database." Alyssa continued, staring tragically into the lens. "My broke, jealous sister committed wire fraud to cancel our family vacation and drain my father's bank accounts just out of pure spite. We were thrown out onto the street in a freezing storm. Please tag the authorities. She is dangerous and needs to be stopped." I watched the video loop back to the beginning. The comments section was an absolute war zone, flooding in by the thousands every second. People were blindly calling for my arrest, tagging federal law enforcement agencies, and demanding swift justice for Alyssa and her shivering dogs. My sister had just declared public war in front of millions of strangers. She thought she was destroying a helpless customer service representative. What she did not realize was that she had just brought a smartphone to a corporate battlefield, and I owned all the ammunition. The notifications on my phone multiplied so fast the screen blurred into a solid block of white light. Alyssa had weaponized her 1 million followers with ruthless efficiency, and the digital fallout was instantaneous. My inbox flooded with hateful messages from complete strangers demanding I apologize to my sister. People I had never met called me a jealous monster, a thief, and a pathetic loser. They left aggressive comments on my old social media posts, tagging local police departments and demanding my immediate arrest. Alyssa had even posted a link to my personal email address encouraging her digital mob to flood it with demands for financial restitution. The sheer scale of the cyberbullying was designed to terrify me into submission. They wanted me to panic. They wanted me to beg for forgiveness. Instead, I simply turned my phone face down on my sleek mahogany desk and took a sip of my black coffee. Then my office phone rang. It was not a client, a wealthy investor, or one of my property managers. It was my private line, a secure number I only ever gave to my family for absolute emergencies. I picked up the receiver and instantly had to pull it away from my ear. My mother Caroline was screaming so loudly the audio distorted through the speaker. "Tessa, you malicious little thief. I demand you wire $65,000 to my account this exact second." I calmly placed the receiver on speakerphone and leaned back in my leather ergonomic chair. "Hello to you too, Mom. I hope the drive to the motel was scenic." "Do not use that tone with me," Caroline shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls of my office. "You committed grand larceny. You stole from your own father. Alyssa has lawyers looking into this right now. We are going straight to the police. You will be sitting in a federal prison by the end of the week if you do not pay us back for the absolute embarrassment you caused us. We are staying in a room that smells like bleach and cheap air freshener." Elijah had to leave his designer luggage in the lobby because there was no space in the room. "You owe us the $65,000 plus emotional damages for what you put us through." I pulled up a blank spreadsheet on my monitor, tracing the absurd line of my mother's logic. "I did not steal anything, Mom. I simply stopped paying for your luxury vacation. Dad put his card on file for incidentals. He signed the user agreement before you arrived. The estate just charged him the standard nightly rate." "You are a complete degenerate," Caroline snapped, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "You have been a degenerate since you got knocked up at 20 and shamed this entire family. We tried to cover up your mistakes. We tried to hide the fact that you ruined your life. And how do you repay us? By hacking into a travel agency to ruin your sister's vacation out of pure spite." I took a slow breath, letting the insult about my daughter wash over me without leaving a mark. Abby was not a mistake. She was my greatest motivation. Everything I built to give her the life my family tried to deny us. "Alyssa is a star." Caroline continued her rage, amplifying with every word. "Elijah is a multimillionaire. Do you even comprehend who you are messing with? Elijah is furious. He is going to find out exactly who owns that pathetic little call center you work for. He's going to buy the entire company and fire you personally. You will be out on the street with your child, and no one in this family will lift a single finger to help you." I reached out and pressed the mute button on my phone console. While my mother continued her unhinged rant into the digital void, I swiveled my chair toward my triple monitor setup. My company, Lux Haven Estates, did not just manage high-end properties. We managed ultra-high net worth individuals. To ensure our clients could actually afford our $15 million rentals, my financial security team utilized proprietary software that ran deep forensic background checks on anyone who booked with us. I opened the secure terminal and typed in Elijah's full legal name, along with the name of his venture capital crypto firm. I bypassed the standard public filings and accessed the restricted financial activity logs. If Elijah wanted to buy my company, I wanted to see exactly what kind of capital he was working with. Lines of financial data cascaded down my screen. I scanned the numbers looking for the vast wealth my family constantly bragged about at their country club dinners. There was no vast wealth. Instead, my screen lit up with severe red flags. Elijah's firm was hemorrhaging money at a catastrophic rate. His liquid assets were heavily leveraged against high-interest loans. He was moving capital from new investors directly into the accounts of older investors to simulate rapid growth. It was the textbook definition of a massive Ponzi scheme. But the most interesting piece of data was a massive withdrawal processed just yesterday. A major institutional investor had completely liquidated their position in his fund, pulling out over $30 million, and triggering a margin call that Elijah could not possibly cover. He was totally bankrupt. I reached over and unmuted the phone. My mother was still shouting, "I will see you in court, Tessa. You are going to pay for this." "Mom," I said smoothly, cutting through her hysteria with a calm, measured tone. "Tell Elijah he cannot afford to buy a coffee stand right now, let alone a company." "Excuse me?" Caroline gasped, momentarily derailed by my response. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the mahogany desk. "You heard me. While you are sitting in that cheap motel plotting my downfall, you might want to ask your golden son-in-law about his venture capital firm. Ask him why his lead investor just pulled out $30 million yesterday. Ask him how he plans to cover the margin calls when the bank realizes his entire fund is a giant scam." The line went dead silent. I could hear the faint sound of traffic passing by their motel, but my mother did not utter a single word. "Let me be very clear." I continued, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "If Alyssa does not take down that video and stop her followers from harassing me within the next 10 minutes, I will forward this entire financial report directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Enjoy the rest of your vacation." I hung up the phone. The silence in my office was absolute perfection. The perfection lasted exactly 24 hours. Then my private office line rang again. It was not my mother throwing another tantrum. The caller ID displayed the prestigious crest of Prescott Preparatory Academy, the highly exclusive private elementary school my daughter Abby attended. I picked up the receiver, expecting a routine call about a forgotten lunchbox or a minor playground disagreement. Instead, I heard the frantic, shaking voice of the school secretary. She told me my mother and sister were currently standing in the main administration office, loudly demanding to pull Abby out of her second-grade classroom. I stood up so fast, my heavy leather chair slammed violently into the glass wall behind my desk. The secretary sounded terrified. She said my mother was screaming at the administrative staff, claiming I was an unfit parent facing imminent federal wire fraud charges. They were demanding the school expel Abby immediately to protect the other wealthy students from our supposedly dangerous criminal family. I told the secretary to lock Abby in the principal's private office with a dedicated security guard and said I would be there in exactly 12 minutes. I grabbed my keys, bypassed my executive assistants without a word, and took the private elevator straight down to the underground parking garage. My personal driver had the sleek black Maybach waiting with the engine running. I climbed into the back seat and told him to get to Prescott Preparatory as fast as legally possible. I took a deep, centering breath, smoothing the lapels of my sharp black Tom Ford suit. I had chosen it this morning for an important board meeting, but it doubled perfectly as armor. For my entire life, my family had treated me like a helpless, uneducated burden. They truly believed I was a struggling single mother who would crumble the second they applied real pressure. They thought cornering my child at her school would humiliate me. They thought causing a public scene would force me to surrender and wire them the $65,000 they desperately needed to save face and avoid total bankruptcy. They were about to learn a very hard, very public lesson about what happens when you threaten a mother who holds all the cards. We pulled through the towering wrought iron gates of the academy, and the chaos was immediately visible. My mother and sister had dragged their hysterical performance out of the administration building and directly into the immaculate central courtyard. It was afternoon pickup time. Dozens of the wealthiest, most influential parents in Boston were standing around the manicured lawns, watching the bizarre spectacle unfold with wide eyes. Caroline was waving her arms wildly, her shrill voice echoing off the historic brick walls of the academic buildings. She was screaming to anyone who would listen, desperately trying to rally the other elite parents against me. She pointed her manicured finger at the main office doors, shrieking that the school was harboring a criminal's child. Alyssa stood right beside her, recording the entire unhinged meltdown on her smartphone for her digital followers, hoping to squeeze some viral sympathy out of the scene. I stepped out of the Maybach. The heavy reinforced door closed behind me with a solid echoing thud. The shocked chatter of the wealthy parents died down instantly as they turned to look at me. I walked across the cobblestone courtyard with slow, measured, completely unfazed steps. My mother spotted me approaching, and her eyes lit up with malicious, arrogant triumph. She marched forward and pointed right at my chest. "There she is! Caroline yelled, her voice raw and cracking with spite. "The welfare case herself. Everyone look at her. She is an absolute fraud. She stole $65,000 from her own father to pay for a fake lifestyle. She is facing federal wire fraud charges, and she belongs in a prison cell, not at an elite academy like this. You all need to demand her daughter be expelled before she steals from your families too." Alyssa shoved her phone camera right into my face, trying to capture my reaction. "Tell the truth, Tessa," she sneered, her voice dripping with fake outrage. "Tell everyone how you hacked my travel agency. Tell them you are nothing but a broke high school dropout who cannot afford to keep her kid in a place like this without stealing from your real family." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or break my composure. I simply looked at my mother and my sister with absolute chilling pity. I reached out and gently pushed Alyssa's phone camera down toward the pavement. The other parents were whispering now, but not out of disgust toward me. They were looking at Caroline and Alyssa like they were deranged, unhinged trespassers who had wandered in off the street. Before my mother could launch into another screaming fit, the heavy oak doors of the main academic building swung open. Ms. Carter, the fiercely strict headmaster of Prescott Preparatory, rushed out into the courtyard. She was a formidable woman who terrified both students and parents alike with her rigid enforcement of rules, wealth, and decorum. Caroline smiled smugly, crossing her arms over her chest, clearly expecting the headmaster to publicly expel Abby and have me escorted off the premises by the local police. Instead, Ms. Carter walked straight past my mother. She stopped directly in front of me, clasped her hands together, and bowed her head with profound respect. "Ms. Tessa, I am so incredibly sorry for this unprovoked disturbance," Ms. Carter said, her voice carrying clearly across the completely silent courtyard. "Your daughter is perfectly safe in my private office reading a book. Should I have our campus security remove these trespassers from the new library wing you just fully funded?" Caroline's smug smile vanished instantly. Alyssa dropped her phone entirely. It hit the concrete courtyard with a loud crack, shattering the screen. Their jaws hung open in absolute stunned silence as they stared at the gleaming multi-million-dollar architectural marvel towering right behind them, boldly displaying the words, "The Tessa Lux Memorial Library." I did not wait for my mother to close her gaping mouth or for my sister to piece together the shattered remains of her pride. I simply gave Ms. Carter a polite nod, turned on my heel, and stepped back into the quiet luxury of my Maybach. As the tinted windows rolled up, I watched Caroline frantically trying to explain away the massive bronze letters bearing my name to the circling crowd of judgmental parents. It was a beautiful sight, but my attention was already shifting to the next inevitable threat. My family was desperate, and desperate people always escalate. The next morning, the espresso machine hissed softly in the background of Le Petit Café, an exclusive members-only coffee lounge situated right across the plaza from the Lux Haven corporate headquarters. I sat at a quiet corner marble table, dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer, finalizing a lucrative commercial acquisition on my tablet. The ambient jazz music and the low hum of wealthy patrons conducting morning business created a perfect environment for focus. That peace was shattered when the heavy brass door of the cafe swung open with unnecessary force. Elijah stalked into the room. He was a tall, heavily built man who frequently used his physical presence as a weapon in boardrooms, and he was clearly planning to use it on me now. He wore a bespoke navy suit that screamed old money, but his eyes betrayed a frantic, cornered energy. He scanned the quiet room, locked eyes with me, and marched over, his heavy footsteps echoing against the polished tile. He did not bother with a greeting. He slammed a thick stack of legal papers directly onto my keyboard, nearly toppling my espresso cup. The aggressive thud made the nearby barista jump, but I kept my gaze perfectly level, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a flinch. "Sign it," Elijah demanded, leaning his large frame over the small marble table to cast a shadow over me. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble intended to intimidate. I glanced down at the document. The bold header read, "Sworn confession of fraudulent activity and agreement of restitution." I looked back up at his glaring face, completely unfazed. "You really have lost your mind, Elijah," I said, my voice steady and unbothered. "You are the one who has lost her mind," he snarled, slamming his fist against the table for emphasis. Alyssa is an absolute wreck. She is losing brand deals by the hour because her followers think we are broke. You are going to sign this confession admitting you hacked the reservation system and committed wire fraud to cancel our trip. Then you are going to wire us the $65,000 you owe us for emotional distress. Or what I asked, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. Or I will bury you, he threatened, bringing his face inches from mine. I have the absolute best corporate lawyers in the country on retainer. They will tie you up in so much litigation you will be bankrupt before we even reach discovery. I know exactly who you are, Tessa. You are a high school dropout playing dress-up. You are a struggling, pathetic single mother who got lucky with some low-level desk job. He leaned closer, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. You have always been jealous of us, Tessa. You resent the fact that Alyssa married a self-made titan while you ruined your life before it even started. My firm moves hundreds of millions of dollars a day. I manipulate global markets before breakfast. You manage customer complaints. Do not mistake my patience for weakness. If you do not wire those funds by noon, my legal team will execute a strike so severe you will never recover. When they are done with you, you and that kid will be out on the street begging for handouts. He sneered, tapping the fraudulent legal document with a heavy gold ring. Sign the paper, Tessa. Save yourself the humiliation of a public federal trial. Alyssa needs this payout to save her influencer brand, and I am not leaving this cafe until you give it to her. I let his threats hang in the air for a long moment. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was terrified. His financial world was imploding, and he was desperately trying to bully a woman he perceived as weak into handing over a quick cash infusion to keep his sinking ship afloat for a few more days. I simply reached into my designer leather tote and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I placed it directly over his ridiculous cease and desist letter. "What is this?" he scoffed, his arrogance faltering just a fraction as he stared at the unmarked envelope. I casually took a slow sip of my espresso, savoring the rich dark roast before locking my eyes onto his. "Before your imaginary lawyers destroy me, Elijah, you might want to explain to the SEC why you have been using your client's escrow funds to pay the lease on your private jet." Elijah went entirely pale. The aggressive, towering posture evaporated instantly, and he stumbled backward a half step, as if I had physically struck him in the chest. I opened the envelope and spread the high-resolution printed spreadsheets across the table. "Did you really think I would not run a full forensic audit on you after you threatened my daughter?" I asked, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "I see everything, Elijah. I see the phantom investors you invented to pad your quarterly reports. I see the margin calls you are currently dodging. I see the $30 million your lead investor pulled out yesterday morning." I tapped the financial logs detailing his offshore wire transfers. "Your firm moves nothing," I corrected sharply. "You shuffle capital from new marks to pay off old ones. It is sloppy, Elijah. The transfers to the Cayman Islands to hide your insolvency were particularly amateur. Did Alyssa know the vintage champagne she was drinking in Malibu was paid for by the stolen retirement funds of a tech startup founder in Silicon Valley? Or is she just as willfully ignorant as the rest of my family? Your entire venture capital firm is a hollow Ponzi scheme, and you are completely bankrupt." His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The confident, wealthy crypto genius was gone, replaced by a terrified con artist staring at the undeniable proof of his impending ruin. "You are going to take this pathetic piece of paper," I said, sliding his fake confession back toward him, "and you are going to walk out of this cafe. If you or my family ever approach my daughter or threaten me again, I will send this entire unredacted file to the federal authorities and every single investor you have defrauded. Do we have an understanding?" Elijah stared at me, his hands physically shaking as he realized the broke sister-in-law he loved to mock held the key to his absolute destruction. He did not say a single word. He snatched his useless legal papers off the table, turned around, and practically ran out the door. He didn't make it more than 5 steps past the cafe's heavy brass doors before he froze. I watched through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows as his broad shoulders slumped in defeat. The reality of his situation had finally pierced through his thick skull. Running away would not erase the digital record sitting on my table. Running away would not stop the federal authorities from freezing his assets by nightfall. He slowly turned around, the arrogant swagger completely gone, and walked heavily back inside. He approached my table like a man walking to the gallows, dropped into the chair across from me, and grabbed the manila envelope. He ripped open the folder, tearing the thick paper in his haste. He pulled out the stack of financial records and laid them flat on the marble surface. His breathing grew shallow and erratic as he flipped through the pages. I watched his eyes dart over the highlighted columns, the offshore transfer logs, and the glaring massive deficits. "How did you get this?" He choked out, his voice entirely stripped of its former bravado. "This is heavily encrypted. This is stored on secure private servers." I leaned forward, folding my hands neatly on the tabletop. "When dealing with ultra-high net worth individuals, my company cannot afford liability," I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. Lux Haven Estates runs rigorous forensic background checks on every single client before we approve a luxury rental. We do not just look at basic credit scores, Elijah. We look at liquidity, debt-to-income ratios, and offshore tax havens. We ensure our clients are exactly who they claim to be. Your profile triggered every single red flag in our proprietary system. I watched him swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "It took my financial security team less than 10 minutes to map your entire ecosystem," I continued. "Your crypto fund is not a venture capital firm. It is a massive, incredibly sloppy Ponzi scheme. You have been using new client deposits to pay out early investors, and you have been skimming the escrow accounts to fund Alyssa's luxury lifestyle. The private jet leases, the designer handbags, the $15 million Malibu rentals. None of it is real wealth. It is all stolen money." The arrogant, wealthy crypto bro persona evaporated completely. The perfectly tailored navy suit suddenly looked like a costume draped over a terrified child. His chest heaved as he frantically shuffled the papers, desperately looking for a mistake, a loophole, or any sign that I was bluffing. There was none. Every fraudulent transfer, every fake invoice, and every hidden deficit was printed out in high-resolution black and white. "You cannot do this," he whispered, raw panic bleeding into his words. "Tessa, you cannot send this to the authorities. They will lock me away for decades. I will lose everything." "You already lost everything the moment your lead investor pulled their $30 million yesterday morning," I stated coldly. "I am simply the person handing you the final bill. Take your fake cease and desist letters, pack up your designer luggage, and leave my family alone. If I ever hear my mother or sister mention my daughter's name again, this file goes directly to the federal prosecutor." Suddenly, Elijah's demeanor shifted. The sheer terror morphed into a cornered, desperate rage. He slammed his hands flat against the marble table and lunged across the space between us. He knocked over his chair in the process, leaning so close I could smell the stale mints on his breath. "If you leak this, you destroy your father too," he hissed, his eyes wide and wild. "Who do you think co-signed my seed loans, you stupid girl?" The air in my lungs vanished. I froze completely, my hand stopping inches from my espresso cup. The ambient jazz music and the low chatter of the cafe seemed to fade into a dull, rushing hum. I stared at him, searching his frantic eyes for a lie, but all I saw was the ugly, unvarnished truth. "What did you just say?" I demanded, my voice losing its practiced calm for the very first time. Elijah let out a harsh, breathless laugh, sensing he had finally found my vulnerability. "You really did not know, did you? Your precious father wanted so desperately to be part of the elite inner circle. He wanted to brag at the country club about his genius son-in-law. When I started the fund, I needed massive institutional backing to make it look legitimate. Thomas practically begged to be my primary guarantor." My mind raced, connecting the terrifying dots. My father's logistics company was highly successful, but it was not multinational corporate wealth. It was comfortable upper-class suburban wealth. To back a crypto fund of that magnitude, he would have needed massive liquid collateral. He leveraged everything, Elijah spat out, confirming my absolute worst fears. He took out second and third mortgages on the family estate. He put up the entire logistics company as collateral. He signed away his pension, his savings, and everything he spent 40 years building. He is in for $12 million, Tessa. Every single penny he owns is tied directly to my firm's solvency. I sat perfectly still, my mind struggling to process the catastrophic scale of my father's arrogance. He had always been obsessed with status. He had spent his entire life looking down on people he deemed beneath him, judging me for a teenage pregnancy, mocking my career choices, and treating service workers like dirt. He wanted the prestige of an ultra-wealthy family so badly that he blindly handed his entire legacy to a charismatic con artist. If I go down, Thomas goes down with me. Elijah sneered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. The bank will call in the loans the exact second the SEC freezes my accounts. They will seize your parents' house. They will liquidate your father's business. Your mother will be out on the street with absolutely nothing. You think you are protecting your family by threatening me? You send that file and you make your own parents homeless. The bitter irony was almost suffocating. My father had literally tossed cheap sleeping bags at my feet just days ago, telling me to sleep on a freezing marble floor. He had prioritized a pair of purebred dogs over his own granddaughter's comfort. Now his entire financial existence rested squarely in the palm of my hand. If I pushed the button to destroy Elijah, I would completely annihilate my parents in the blast radius. For a fraction of a second, the ingrained, dutiful daughter inside me hesitated. I pictured the sprawling suburban mansion I grew up in being auctioned off to the highest bidder. I pictured my father, a man whose entire identity was built on country club prestige, being stripped of his membership and forced to face public ruin. I pictured my mother trading her designer wardrobe for the harsh reality of actual poverty. It was a terrifying image. Then my phone buzzed, shattering the silence of the cafe. It was a text from my father. Family meeting at the house. Tonight at 8. Mandatory attendance. Do not test my patience today, Tessa. The brief flash of sympathy I felt vanished, replaced by an absolute diamond-hard clarity. My father had not been tricked into backing Elijah. He had mortgaged his legacy out of pure, unadulterated greed and a desperate need to associate with a flashy crypto billionaire. He had bet against his own daughter for years, and now he was demanding I show up to answer his summons as if I were still a scared, helpless teenager. I paid for my espresso, leaving the cash on the table, and walked out to my waiting car. At exactly 8 o'clock, I pulled my Maybach through the wrought iron gates of my parents' estate in Fairfield. The sweeping driveway was lined with perfectly manicured hedges, a facade of immense wealth that I now knew was entirely funded by fraudulent leverage. I walked up the marble steps and pushed open the heavy oak front door without knocking. They were waiting for me in the formal dining room. The atmosphere was thick with tension. My father sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his hands clasped tightly together. My mother sat to his right, her lips pressed into a thin, anxious line. Alyssa and Elijah stood near the massive fireplace, presenting a united front, though Elijah refused to meet my eyes. He looked physically ill. "Sit down," Tessa Thomas ordered, using the deep authoritative voice he usually reserved for reprimanding insubordinate employees. I remained standing. I crossed my arms over my chest and looked down at him. "I am fine right here. Tell me what this is about, Thomas. I have a company to run." My mother scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Stop playing CEO, Tessa. We do not have time for your childish fantasies tonight. This is serious family business." Thomas held up a hand to silence her. He picked up a thick stack of legal documents resting on the table in front of him. He tapped the edges against the polished wood, adopting a tone of benevolent paternal patience. "As you know, your 28th birthday is approaching next month," he began smoothly. "When your grandmother passed away, she set up a trust fund for you. It was a foolish decision, frankly, given your history of poor life choices, but it legally matures upon your 28th birthday. The principal sits at just over $4 million. I kept my face perfectly neutral. I had known about the trust for years. My grandmother had been the only person in this family who saw my potential. She had explicitly structured the trust so my father could not touch a single penny, locking it away until I was old enough to defend myself against his financial manipulations. Your mother and I have been discussing the future of the family logistics company. Thomas continued, refusing to look me in the eye. We are currently navigating a minor cash flow issue. It is a temporary restructuring hurdle, nothing more. However, to expedite the process, we require a rapid injection of liquid capital. I have drawn up the necessary paperwork for you to sign your grandmother's trust directly over to the corporate holding account. He slid a silver Mont Blanc pen across the table toward me. It stopped inches from my hand. It is the least you can do, Caroline added, leaning forward with an expectant, demanding glare. We provided for you when you got pregnant. We kept a roof over your head. It is time you finally contribute to the family legacy instead of dragging it down. I stared at the pen, then looked directly at Elijah. The venture capitalist was sweating visibly, his hands gripping the mantel of the fireplace so tightly his knuckles were white. He knew exactly what this was. This was not a minor cash flow issue. This was my father desperately trying to seize my $4 million inheritance to cover a fraction of the margin calls Elijah's collapsing Ponzi scheme was about to trigger. They were trying to steal my grandmother's final gift to me to plug a $12 million hole in a sinking ship. I am not signing anything, I said. My voice was calm, steady, and absolutely resolute. Alyssa slammed her hand against the marble fireplace. You selfish little brat! She screamed, her face contorting with rage. You owe us! Do you hear me? You owe this family everything. We fed you. We clothed you. We put up with the shame of your teenage mistakes while you contributed absolutely nothing to society. Dad needs this money to expand the business, and you are going to give it to him because it is your duty. You are not expanding a business, Alyssa, I replied. My eyes locked on Elijah. Your husband is about to be indicted for wire fraud, and he dragged our father down with him. I am not funding a bailout for a criminal. Elijah flinched, taking a step back as if he had been struck. Alyssa turned to him, confusion flashing across her angry features. But Thomas slammed his fist down on the dining table with terrifying force. The crystal glasses rattled violently. Enough! Thomas roared, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. He pushed his chair back and stood up, towering over the table. He dropped the facade of the patient patriarch instantly. His eyes were lethally cold, devoid of any paternal warmth. We knew you would be difficult, Thomas snarled, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. You have always been stubborn, arrogant, and entirely ungrateful. You lack the mental capacity to manage that kind of wealth. We anticipated your innate selfishness, Tessa. He reached into a secondary folder on the table and pulled out a fresh legal document bearing the official seal of the state court. He slid it forcefully across the polished mahogany. It stopped right next to the silver pen. We have already filed a petition for conservatorship, Thomas stated, his eyes locking onto mine with ruthless intent. We have medical affidavits claiming your history of erratic behavior, your teenage pregnancy, and your inability to maintain stable employment render you mentally unfit to handle your own financial affairs. The judge is a personal friend of mine from the country club. The hearing is merely a formality. You are not getting a dime. The absolute silence in the dining room was broken by the sound of slow, arrogant clapping coming from the shadows of the adjoining library. A man I had never seen before stepped into the light. He wore a rumpled gray suit that smelled faintly of cheap cologne and stale tobacco, a stark contrast to my parents' meticulously curated environment. He had a slick, overly confident smile plastered across his face as he walked toward the mahogany table. He carried a thick, heavily tabbed medical file under his arm, the fabricated threat. Allow me to introduce Arthur Vance, Thomas said, gesturing to the man. He is a specialist in family law and conservatorship petitions. He has been incredibly thorough in compiling the necessary evidence to protect our family assets from your unfortunate mental decline. Arthur Vance did not bother with a polite greeting. He simply dropped the thick file directly onto the polished wood, sliding it until it hit the edge of the conservatorship petition. It is a tragedy, really, Arthur said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. We have pulled your medical records from 7 years ago, Tessa. The documentation regarding your severe postpartum depression is quite extensive. The prolonged crying spells, the mandated therapy sessions, the prescribed medications. It paints a deeply disturbing picture of a young woman completely overwhelmed by reality. I stared at the file, feeling the blood freeze in my veins. They had crossed the final unforgivable line. 7 years ago, I had been a terrified, isolated teenager navigating the overwhelming reality of single motherhood after my entire family had thrown me out onto the street. I had suffered from postpartum depression, sought professional help, and fought my way back to health entirely on my own. Now they were weaponizing my darkest, most vulnerable moments to steal my future. We have brought in private medical experts who are willing to testify that your condition never truly resolved. Arthur continued tapping the file with a blunt fingernail. They will state under oath that your current isolation from your family and your erratic behavior are signs of a severe untreated psychiatric break. A judge will look at this file and immediately conclude that you lack the basic mental capacity to manage a multi-million-dollar trust fund. He leaned across the table, his sleazy smile widening into a threat. More importantly, the judge will also conclude that you lack the mental stability to raise a child. If you fight this conservatorship, Tessa, we will simultaneously file for emergency custody of Abby. We will argue that she is in immediate physical danger in your care. By the time the dust settles, your father will control your finances, and your mother will be raising your daughter, the delusion of grandeur. Caroline crossed her arms, looking down her nose at me with a look of absolute sickening triumph. She truly believed they had me completely cornered. She believed the nightmare they were threatening was already a reality. You brought this entirely on yourself, Tessa. Caroline sneered, her voice echoing harshly in the grand room. You could not even finish a basic college degree. You threw your life away to play the victim, and now you are facing the consequences. You think a judge will trust a dropout single mother over a prominent business owner and a venture capitalist. You think any court in this state will look at our family legacy, our wealth, our connections, and side with you. Alyssa let out a sharp, mocking laugh, her confidence completely restored now that she believed I was about to be destroyed. You owe us for every single teenage mistake you made, Alyssa screamed, pointing a manicured finger at my face. You humiliated this family when you got pregnant. You ruined our reputation. Dad is just taking back what you owe us for dragging our name through the mud. You are going to sign that trust over right now, or you are going to lose Abby forever. Elijah stood taller, puffing out his chest. The terror he had shown in the coffee shop was temporarily masked by the illusion of control my father had just handed him. He genuinely thought this ruthless legal ambush would save him from federal prison. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not beg them to reconsider. I simply looked at the gold Cartier watch on my left wrist. It was exactly 8:15. Right on time, I murmured, the counter-ambush. Before Thomas could ask what I meant, the heavy solid oak front doors of the estate swung open with a resounding crash. The sound of confident, synchronized footsteps echoed across the marble foyer, cutting through the tense silence of the dining room. My parents turned toward the archway in shock. Arthur Vance frowned, stepping back from the table. 3 figures walked into the room. They were impeccably dressed in bespoke, razor-sharp suits that projected an aura of absolute untouchable power. They moved with the predatory grace of apex litigators who destroyed massive corporations for sport. This was the senior litigation team from Sterling Croft and Sinclair, the single most feared, ruthless corporate law firm on the East Coast. At their center was Marcus Sterling himself. He was a towering, silver-haired legal titan whose mere presence in a courtroom usually forced immediate settlements. He did not look at my parents. He did not acknowledge Alyssa or Elijah. He walked directly to the mahogany table, stopping right beside me. Marcus unclasped his leather briefcase and pulled out a massive, heavily bound legal binder. He lifted it high and dropped it directly on top of Arthur Vance's pathetic medical file. The sheer weight of the binder hit the table with a loud, violent crack that made my mother physically jump. Tessa Lux Marcus, said his deep, resonant voice filling the room. It is a pleasure to finally meet your family. He turned his piercing, icy gaze toward Thomas and Arthur. We are filing a massive comprehensive countersuit in federal court tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, Marcus announced, slapping his hand against the heavy binder. The charges include, but are not limited to criminal extortion, severe defamation of character, conspiracy to commit fraud, and the malicious filing of fraudulent medical documents. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Arthur Vance. We have already contacted the state medical board regarding the doctors you bribed to falsify these psychiatric evaluations. They are facing immediate license revocation and criminal charges. Furthermore, we are referring Thomas Lux and Elijah Thorne to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for operating a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme using fraudulently leveraged collateral. Arthur Vance went completely deathly pale. The smug, sleazy smile vanished from his face, replaced by absolute visceral terror. He recognized Marcus Sterling instantly. He knew exactly what kind of firm Sterling Croft and Sinclair was, and he knew they did not make empty threats. Arthur physically stumbled backward, his hands raised in a gesture of frantic surrender as he backed away from the dining table. He looked at my father with wide, panicked eyes. "Thomas, you did not tell me she had Sterling on retainer," Arthur stammered, his voice cracking with fear. "You lied to me. You said she was broke. You said she was a dropout. I cannot be involved in this. This is federal extortion. I am withdrawing my representation immediately." Arthur did not wait for a response. He turned around and practically sprinted toward the front door, abandoning his briefcase and leaving my family staring at the absolute destruction of their master plan. The heavy oak front door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the vaulted ceilings of the foyer. A suffocating, dead silence fell over the mahogany dining table. Thomas stared at the abandoned leather briefcase as if it were an explosive device. Elijah simply collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. Marcus Sterling did not gloat. He simply buttoned his bespoke suit jacket with practiced efficiency. "You have exactly 72 hours to respond to our federal filings," Marcus stated, his voice devoid of any human warmth. "I highly suggest you spend that time finding criminal defense attorneys who are willing to accept whatever worthless assets you have left." I looked at my mother. Caroline was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her mouth opening and closing in mute shock. Alyssa was staring at Elijah with undisguised horror, finally realizing her luxury lifestyle was entirely funded by phantom money. "You bet everything on a con artist, Dad," I said, breaking the silence. "You mortgaged your legacy because you wanted the prestige of a billionaire son-in-law. Now you can pay the price." I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving them to suffocate in the ruins of their own arrogance. The fallout over the next 10 days was swift and brutal. My legal team executed a flawless tactical chokehold on my family's remaining resources. The bank, alerted by our filings, froze Thomas's corporate credit lines. The SEC quietly launched an inquiry into Elijah's crypto fund, halting his ability to wire funds offshore. They were cornered, panicked, and entirely out of options. But desperate men do not simply surrender, they escalate. I was sitting in my corner office at Lux Haven headquarters when my executive assistant knocked on the glass door. She walked in carrying a thick, heavy envelope sealed with a ridiculous amount of gold wax. It had been delivered by a private courier. I cracked the wax seal and pulled out a heavily embossed, incredibly expensive invitation. The elegant cursive text announced the inaugural benefactor gala for the Thorne Lux Foundation, an exclusive black-tie charity event, promising to raise funds for underprivileged youth. I actually laughed out loud. It was a masterpiece of desperation. They were completely bankrupt, facing federal indictments, and their solution was to throw a massive high society gala. They planned to solicit massive untraceable donations from Boston's elite under the guise of philanthropy, using the cash to fund a private flight out of the country before the federal agents arrived with handcuffs. It was the ultimate final grift. But the invitation was not just an announcement. Clipped to the back of the gold foil card was a handwritten note on my father's personal stationery. The words were penned in Caroline's meticulous handwriting, but the malice was entirely Thomas. "Come see what real power looks like. Use the service entrance. We have a settlement for you to sign, or we call Child Protective Services tomorrow. I stared at the note, my blood turning to absolute ice. They were not just trying to steal my grandmother's trust anymore. They were actively weaponizing my daughter. When I was an 18-year-old terrified girl, Caroline had banned me from attending the annual country club winter ball because my changing pregnant body would embarrass her in front of her socialite friends. They had treated my unborn child like a disease. Now they were threatening to fabricate abuse allegations to have Abby ripped from my home just to force me into submission. It was a vile, unforgivable threat. They genuinely believed I would panic. They believed I would sneak through the service entrance terrified of a public scandal and sign away my inheritance to protect my child from a traumatic CPS investigation. They thought I was still that frightened teenager desperate for their approval. I did not panic. I had absolute ironclad proof of my fitness as a mother, backed by pediatricians, teachers, and a pristine home environment. More importantly, Marcus Sterling had already preemptively alerted family court judges to my parents' extortion tactics. Their threat was hollow, but their audacity required a permanent, devastating response. I looked back down at the invitation, my eyes scanning past the ridiculous charity claims and landing on the venue printed at the very bottom. The Sovereign Atrium. It was the most exclusive, breathtaking event space in the entire financial district. A multi-million-dollar architectural marvel boasting glass ceilings, indoor waterfalls, and a 3-year waiting list. It was the perfect place for Thomas and Elijah to project their fake wealth to potential donors. I reached across my desk and picked up my phone. I dialed the direct line to my vice president of operations. He answered on the first ring. "David," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Yes, Ms. Lux. Look at the event schedule for tonight," I instructed. "Tell me who booked the Sovereign Atrium." I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line. "It is booked under a corporate shell company, Ms. Lux. The Thorn Group. They paid the deposit in cash last week. Should I review the catering manifests?" "No," I replied, staring at the gold-embossed invitation in my hand. "They rented the atrium. Cancel all my meetings for the rest of the day, David. Call my styling team and tell them I need a gown. It is time to show my family who actually owns the building." Across town, the atmosphere inside the Thorne estate was a suffocating cocktail of panic and delusion. Thomas sat in his dark mahogany-paneled home office, his expensive tailored shirt stained with heavy patches of sweat beneath the arms. His desk was completely buried under a mountain of final notices, bank ultimatums, and SEC inquiry letters. He aggressively crumpled a foreclosure warning from his primary lender, tossing it onto the floor with a dozen others. He poured himself a tall glass of scotch, his hands shaking so violently the crystal clinked loudly against the heavy glass decanter. This gala was his absolute last resort. If they did not secure at least $8 million in immediate liquid donations tonight, the federal agents would be knocking on his front door by Monday morning. Down the hall, Elijah was pacing the length of the guest bedroom like a caged animal. He had barricaded himself inside, clutching 3 cheap burner phones. He threw one violently against the wall, shattering the screen into pieces before immediately dialing a number on the second. He was barking frantic guttural threats at his remaining investors, promising them astronomical, impossible returns if they just held their positions for another 24 hours. His voice was hoarse, his eyes bloodshot, entirely stripped of the flashy crypto-billionaire persona he presented to the world. He was a cornered rat desperately trying to plug the holes in a sinking ship with imaginary money. In absolute jarring contrast, Alyssa stood in the center of her massive walk-in closet, completely oblivious to the imminent destruction of her entire reality. She was wearing a violently expensive sequined crimson gown, obsessively adjusting the plunging neckline. She practiced a series of haughty red carpet poses in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirrors, tilting her chin up to catch the light perfectly. She was already mentally spending the charity money planning a month-long excursion to Monaco to escape the stress of her sister's supposed mental breakdown. She genuinely believed tonight was her grand coronation as Boston's premier socialite. 50 blocks away in the penthouse suite of the Lux Haven headquarters, I existed in a state of absolute unbreakable serenity. There was no panic, no frantic phone calls, no sweating over spreadsheets. The trap was already set. Now it was simply a matter of flawless execution. I stood motionless on a velvet pedestal while three of the city's top seamstresses made the final microscopic adjustments to my custom haute couture gown. It was a masterclass in midnight blue silk and structured architectural lines projecting an aura of quiet, lethal authority. It was not a dress designed for a smiling charity donor. It was a dress designed for an executioner. While the seamstresses worked, my executive suite was transformed into a tactical command center. David, my vice president of operations, stood by the window with the head of the Sovereign Atrium's audiovisual department. I directed them with calm, precise instructions. I did not just want to interrupt my father's presentation. I wanted total, undeniable control of the entire venue's infrastructure. We rerouted the main projection screens, synchronized the lighting grid to a secondary master control panel, and completely bypassed the DJ's sound system. When the moment came, my family would have absolutely no technological control over the room they thought they had rented. Next came the head of building security, a towering former Navy SEAL who answered exclusively to my holding company. I handed him a digital tablet containing the event manifest. I instructed him to let Thomas, Caroline, Alyssa, and Elijah run the door exactly as they planned. They needed to feel completely in charge. I told him to authorize their hired private bouncers, let them manage the guest list, and give them a false sense of absolute security. My personal detail would remain entirely out of sight, securing the building's perimeter and locking down the service elevators. Finally, Marcus Sterling walked into the suite. The legendary litigator looked exceptionally pleased with himself. He handed me a single crisp legal document enclosed in a black leather folder. It was the finalized eviction notice, coupled with the SEC asset freeze mandate. A federal judge had signed off an hour ago. The Thornlux Foundation was officially classified as a fraudulent enterprise. The gala they were hosting tonight was legally designated as an active crime scene. By 7 o'clock, the heavy brass doors of the Sovereign Atrium opened and Boston's financial elite began to pour into the breathtaking space. The venue was a marvel of modern design, featuring cascading indoor waterfalls, imported rare orchids, and towering glass ceilings that reflected the glittering city skyline. My parents and the Thorns stood at the grand entrance playing the roles of benevolent philanthropists to absolute perfection. Caroline was draped in borrowed diamonds, air-kissing politicians, and hedge fund managers. Thomas shook hands with aggressive enthusiasm, his desperate sweat hidden beneath a freshly pressed tuxedo. Elijah and Alyssa posed for the hired photographers, presenting a flawless, united front of immense wealth and success. They looked around the opulent atrium, completely convinced they had orchestrated the perfect salvation. I was sitting in the back of my Maybach, parked 3 blocks away, watching a live security feed of the entrance on my tablet. The sheer audacity of their performance was almost impressive. My phone buzzed on the leather seat beside me. The screen lit up with a text message from Alyssa. "Do not even bother showing up, Tessa. We hired private security to man the front doors and the service entrance. They have your photo. If you try to sneak in and cause a scene, you will be arrested on site for trespassing. Enjoy losing your daughter." I read the message twice. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I locked my phone and slipped it into my clutch. I tapped the glass partition separating me from my driver. "Take us to the main entrance," I said softly. The Maybach glided smoothly through the financial district, pulling up to the red carpet rolling out from the Sovereign Atrium's massive glass doors. Flashbulbs erupted as the vehicle came to a stop. The valet rushed forward, opening the heavy door. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, the midnight blue silk of my gown catching the bright flash of the cameras. I looked past the red carpet, past the hired bouncers, straight toward the grand entrance where my sister was holding a glass of champagne. Let them try. The moment my heels touched the velvet ropes, the entire atmosphere of the red carpet shifted. The paparazzi, seasoned veterans who spent their lives hunting for the slightest hint of power and wealth, immediately smelled blood in the water. They abandoned the minor local celebrities and flocked to my side of the barricade. The midnight blue silk of my gown flowed around me like liquid armor, the architectural cut catching the relentless explosion of camera flashes. Shouts of my name echoed over the roar of the crowd. I did not shrink. I did not lower my head. I walked straight up the center of the crimson carpet, claiming every single inch of the space they had explicitly forbidden me from entering. Through the towering glass of the VIP double doors, I saw the exact moment the illusion shattered. Alyssa was mid-laugh, her head thrown back, holding her champagne flute for a photographer. Then her eyes locked onto mine. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow beneath her heavy makeup. Her jaw slackened. She lowered the crystal glass, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the delicate stem, realizing instantly that every camera in the venue had turned away from her and was now focused entirely on me. Thomas saw the commotion. His desperate, carefully curated smile vanished, replaced by a dark, feral rage. He whispered something sharp to Caroline, shoving past two wealthy donors without apologizing. He marched straight through the massive glass doors and down the red carpet, completely abandoning his polished patriarchal persona. He reached me just as I crossed the threshold into the grand foyer. His hand shot out, his fingers digging into my bare arm with bruising, violent force. "I told you to use the back door," Thomas hissed, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of panic and fury. His grip tightened, attempting to physically steer me away from the flashing cameras and toward the shadows of the coat check. "You are nothing but an embarrassing mistake. You have always been a mistake. Get out right now before Elijah ruins you completely." I looked down at the hand gripping my arm. I did not flinch. I did not try to pull away. I simply stared at his fingers, then looked up into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. The days of him using physical intimidation to force me into submission were entirely over. "Take your hand off me, Thomas," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute freezing weight of someone who held all the cards. Before he could register the lethal calm in my tone, Elijah rushed over, his face flushed a dangerous mottled red. He had seen the altercation and was eager to play the powerful billionaire protector in front of the gathered elite. He puffed out his chest, stepping between me and the main ballroom, blocking my path with aggressive arrogance. "You were warned, Tessa." Elijah snarled, adjusting his silk bow tie with a trembling hand. "We gave you a chance to handle this quietly, but you just had to make a scene. You are trespassing on a private, highly secured event." He turned his head toward the massive, heavily armed security personnel stationed near the entrance. These were the men I had authorized just an hour ago, standing stoic and immovable in their black suits. Elijah raised his hand and snapped his fingers with a loud theatrical crack, pointing directly at my face. "You," Elijah barked at the nearest guard. "Grab her and throw her out into the street. If she resists, call the police and press charges for criminal trespass." The main ballroom had grown eerily quiet. Dozens of high-profile guests, city officials and corporate investors had paused their conversations, watching the drama unfold in the foyer. Alyssa stood a few feet away, a triumphant, vicious sneer returning to her lips as she waited for the hired muscle to drag me out into the gutter. She was practically vibrating with anticipation. The head of security, the towering former Navy SEAL I had met with in my penthouse, stepped forward. He moved with a heavy, deliberate stride that made the marble floor seem to vibrate. Elijah smirked, crossing his arms over his chest, expecting the guard to seize my shoulders and violently drag me away. Instead, the massive man marched directly past Elijah, not even affording him a single glance. He stopped precisely 2 feet in front of me, planting his feet firmly. He ignored my father. He ignored my sister. He clasped his hands behind his back and bowed his head deeply in a gesture of absolute, undeniable respect. "Is this man bothering you?" "Boss, the head of security?" asked his deep voice booming through the silent foyer. "Do you need him removed from your property?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of reality crashing down on top of a delusion. Elijah's jaw dropped. His arms fell limply to his sides, the arrogant sneer melting off his face as his brain violently rejected what he had just heard. He looked at the guard, then at me, his eyes wide with a sudden suffocating terror. He realized in real time that the rented security team worked directly for me. Thomas released my arm as if he had been burned. He stumbled back a half step, staring at the security team that was now universally shifting their stance, turning their imposing attention away from the doors and directly onto him and Elijah. Alyssa let out a small, strangled gasp. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sharp crash. "My property!" Thomas repeated, his voice barely a hollow whisper. "What does he mean, your property?" I smoothed the silk of my gown where his hand had wrinkled it. I stepped forward, forcing Thomas to retreat another inch. I looked at the three of them, savoring the absolute destruction of their final desperate grift. "I mean exactly what he said," I replied, my voice ringing clear and steady across the opulent atrium. "You wanted to show me what real power looks like tonight." I decided to accept the invitation. "I own the sovereign atrium. I own the security team you just tried to order around. And in about 10 minutes, when the federal agents walk through those glass doors, I am going to own whatever is left of your miserable, fraudulent lives." For a fraction of a second, the sheer gravitational weight of my words pinned them to the marble floor. Thomas's jaw hung slack, his face a sickly shade of gray, as his brain struggled to process the total collapse of his authority. Elijah looked like a man standing on the gallows, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass doors as if calculating the odds of outrunning a federal indictment. But Alyssa could not comprehend defeat. Her entire existence was built on the delusion of her own supremacy, funded by Daddy's money and a fraudulent husband. Her mind violently rejected the reality that the sister she had mocked and degraded for years was standing before her as an untouchable titan. Alyssa let out a high-pitched, hysterical sound. She spun around, her crimson sequins flashing under the chandeliers, and sprinted toward the main ballroom. She was running on pure, unadulterated panic, desperate to control the narrative before I could destroy it. I followed at a measured, unhurried pace. The head of security walked exactly 2 steps behind my right shoulder, matching my stride. By the time I entered the grand ballroom, Alyssa had already pushed past the hired string quartet and scrambled up the carpeted steps to the main stage. She snatched the microphone from the acrylic podium with such force that a sharp whine of audio feedback pierced the elegant hum of the room. Hundreds of Boston's wealthiest investors, hedge fund managers, and socialites stopped their conversations mid-sentence and turned toward the stage in confusion. "Do not listen to her!" Alyssa shrieked into the microphone, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted glass ceilings. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me as I walked slowly down the center aisle. "She is a fraud. She is my mentally unstable sister, and she is trying to crash our charity event." The crowd of billionaires and socialites parted around me, murmuring in hushed, scandalized tones. I kept my eyes locked on Alyssa, my expression perfectly serene. "She has been stalking us," Alyssa yelled, her chest heaving as she gripped the microphone stand like a lifeline. "She is a broke college dropout who got pregnant at 18 and ruined her life. She is absolutely delusional. She is obsessed with our wealth because she has nothing. Someone call the police. I want her arrested right now." Her voice cracked on the final word, a desperate, pathetic screech that hung awkwardly in the silence of the massive room. This was classic Alyssa. Whenever she felt threatened, she resorted to public humiliation. I remembered being 16, standing in the living room while she screamed at my parents that I had stolen her designer watch, knowing full well she had pawned it herself to pay off a secret credit card. She had always used volume and hysteria to rewrite reality and make me the villain. But hysterics do not work in the boardroom, and they certainly do not work in my building. I reached the front of the ballroom and ascended the velvet-lined stairs to the stage. The heavy silk of my midnight blue gown brushed against the steps with a quiet, lethal grace. Alyssa backed away slightly as I approached, her eyes wide with a frantic, cornered energy. I did not raise my hand. I did not shout. I simply extended my arm and wrapped my fingers firmly around the microphone. Alyssa tried to hold on, her knuckles turning white, but she was shaking too violently. I pulled the microphone from her grip with a smooth, effortless motion. She let out a small, defeated gasp and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own expensive heels. I turned to face the sea of shocked faces. The room was absolutely silent. I could see Thomas and Elijah standing at the very back of the ballroom, trapped between the closed double doors and the wall of my security guards. Caroline was clutching Thomas's arm, her face buried against his shoulder in sheer panic. I brought the microphone to my lips. "Welcome, everyone, to the Sovereign Atrium," I said. My voice was calm, resonant, and projected with the absolute authority of a woman completely in her element. As the founder and CEO of Luxhaven Estates, I am thrilled to personally host you tonight. For 2 entire seconds, the room remained dead silent. Then the realization swept through the crowd like a tidal wave. Gasps erupted from the front tables, whispers ignited across the room, spreading like wildfire. Luxhaven Estates was not just a successful company. It was a notoriously private, aggressively expanding real estate empire that owned half the commercial properties in the financial district. The CEO was a phantom, an elusive architect of wealth who routinely rejected acquisition offers from the exact men standing in this room. A billionaire venture capitalist in the front row, a man named Sterling Vance, who Thomas had been desperately following around all night begging for a capital injection, dropped his champagne glass. It shattered on the marble floor, but he did not even flinch. He just stared at me, his eyes wide with profound recognition. "That is Tessa Lux," a prominent hedge fund manager whispered loudly to his partner. "I have been trying to secure a 10-minute pitch meeting with her holding company for 6 months. Her office controls the entire waterfront development project." The murmurs quickly morphed into a deafening roar of applause. The ultra-wealthy investors, the very marks Thomas and Elijah had gathered to scam, began clapping with genuine ferocious enthusiasm. Sterling Vance actually stepped forward and bowed his head respectfully. They were not applauding a charity. They were applauding power. They were applauding the woman who held the keys to the city's most lucrative real estate portfolio. I looked down at the back of the room. Thomas was staring at the cheering crowd, his mouth hanging open in complete absolute despair. I remembered standing in his home office at 18, holding my meager savings, while he coldly informed me that my pregnancy was a permanent stain on his legacy. He had told me the business world was a predator's game, and I was already marked as prey. He had told me I would never sit at the adult table. Now the adults in the room were clamoring just to breathe the same air as me, and he was nothing but a beggar at my door. Elijah looked physically sick. He watched the billionaire investors flocking toward the stage, their eyes fixed on me with hungry reverence. He finally understood the catastrophic scale of his mistake. He had not just tried to extort a wealthy woman, he had tried to extort the apex predator of their entire industry. Alyssa stood trembling a few feet away from me on the stage, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were freezing. The red carpet royalty she had pretended to be was completely obliterated. She was just a woman in a borrowed dress standing in a building I owned, surrounded by people who only cared about my name. They had brought me here to show me what real power looked like, and in doing so, they had walked straight into my kingdom. The applause continued to roll through the cavernous glass atrium, a deafening wave of validation from the very people my family had spent months trying to court. Hedge fund managers who had ignored Thomas's calls for weeks were now raising their champagne flutes in my direction. Elijah watched this sudden shift in power from the back of the room. I could see the exact second his raw terror mutated into a sickening, desperate opportunism. He was drowning completely out of options, but he saw me standing on that stage like a life raft. He believed he could hijack my credibility. He shoved his way past the wall of my security guards, elbowing aside bewildered tech CEOs and real estate tycoons. Sweat poured down his face, completely soaking the collar of his expensive tuxedo shirt. He scrambled up the stage steps, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically across the sea of ultra-wealthy investors. He lunged toward a secondary microphone resting on the acrylic podium. Alyssa tried to reach out to him, her face a mask of confusion and terror, but he swatted her hand away. He gripped the microphone, slapping on a plastic, agonizingly fake smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elijah announced, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it into a booming, artificially confident pitch. What an incredible surprise. Please let us have another round of applause for Tessa Lux. The crowd offered a confused smattering of claps. They were elite investors, They could smell desperation like blood in the water, and Elijah reeked of it. I know my sister-in-law likes to make a dramatic entrance, Elijah continued, chuckling nervously as he walked toward me. But since the secret is finally out, we might as well share the whole truth with our esteemed guest tonight. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms wide. Tessa is not just family, he projected, his voice echoing off the glass walls. She is the silent backing behind the Thorn Crypto Initiative. We have been partnering behind the scenes for the past 2 years. Her brilliant real estate acquisitions and my algorithmic trading platform have created the ultimate diversified portfolio. That is why we invited you all here tonight. The Thorn Lux Foundation is simply the philanthropic wing of our joint corporate merger. He stepped closer to me, his eyes wide and silently pleading. He was begging me to play along. He was betting everything on the assumption that I would not publicly humiliate my own family in front of Boston's financial elite. He thought I would protect the family name. He thought I would save him to save myself from scandal. Thomas, standing at the back of the room, suddenly stood taller. A sickening glimmer of hope flashed across his aging face. He actually believed Elijah's insane pivot might work. He thought they could ride my coattails straight out of bankruptcy. I looked at Elijah. I looked at the sweat dripping from his chin, the frantic tremor in his hands, the absolute moral bankruptcy radiating from his pores. I stepped back, putting a solid 5 feet of distance between us. I would never partner with a fraud, I said. My voice was devoid of any warmth, cutting through the warm acoustics of the room like a surgical scalpel. Elijah froze. His plastic smile shattered. I did not break eye contact with him as I raised my left hand and gave a subtle, sharp signal toward the darkened audio-visual booth suspended above the balcony. David was waiting. Instantly, the massive 60-foot LED screens framing the stage went completely black. The elegant gold and silver logos of the fake Thorn Lux Foundation vanished. A collective gasp rippled through the audience as the room was plunged into sudden, stark darkness. A second later, the screens violently roared back to life. They did not display charity banners or philanthropic slogans. They projected high-resolution, unredacted federal legal documents. The header of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission glared in bold, undeniable lettering across the displays. On the left screen, a massive spreadsheet materialized. It detailed the Thorn Crypto Initiative's internal ledger. It showed exactly $0 in actual trading revenue. Below that, a brightly colored flowchart mapped the exact trajectory of every single investment dollar Elijah had collected over the past 18 months. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the graphic traced their investments directly into Elijah's personal offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. On the right screen, the official SEC freezing order was projected in 20-foot text. Elijah spun around, staring at the screens towering behind him. The microphone slipped from his sweaty grip and hit the stage floor with a deafening thud. He staggered backward, his hands pulling at his own hair as his entire fraudulent empire was broadcast to the exact people he had stolen from. "Look at the screens, ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice carrying absolute chilling clarity over the stunned silence of the room. Elijah Thorn's crypto fund is entirely bankrupt. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme. There is no algorithmic trading platform. There are no returns. Every dime you handed him was funneled into offshore shell companies to fund his luxury lifestyle and prop up my father's failing corporate loans. Alyssa let out a piercing scream. She backed away from Elijah, staring at the financial records displaying his absolute ruin. Her Monaco vacations, her designer wardrobe, her entire identity was flashing on the screen as stolen capital. He organized tonight's gala for one specific reason. I continued pacing slowly across the front of the stage. He is facing federal indictment. He intended to use this charity event to steal your liquid donations, bypass his frozen accounts, and fund a private flight out of the country before the authorities arrived. You were not invited here to save underprivileged youth. You were invited here to fund a fugitive's escape. The silence broke. It did not just break, it shattered into a million jagged pieces of absolute unhinged fury. The ultra-wealthy do not tolerate being made fools of, and they certainly do not tolerate being robbed. A billionaire tech mogul in the second row hurled his champagne glass at the stage. It shattered against the edge of the stairs. Dozens of furious investors surged forward, their voices rising into a deafening roar of rage and betrayal. They were screaming for Elijah's head. They were pointing at Thomas, who was now pinned against the back doors by my security team, his face drained of all blood. Elijah scrambled backward on the stage, completely surrounded by the furious mob of his own victims. He looked left and right, his eyes wild, searching for any possible exit. My security detail closed ranks around the perimeter of the stage, ensuring none of the aggressive investors could physically reach us, but simultaneously ensuring Elijah had absolutely nowhere to run. I stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos. I watched my sister collapse onto the stage floor, weeping hysterically as her fake empire burned to ash. I watched my father frantically trying to bargain with my security guards, begging them to open the doors. Then, piercing through the shouts and the shattering glass, a new sound emerged. It started as a faint, distant wail, echoing down the canyon of skyscrapers outside. Within seconds, it multiplied, growing louder, sharper, and utterly undeniable. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the towering glass ceiling of the atrium, painting the room in the harsh colors of justice. The federal agents had arrived. A dozen men and women wearing dark windbreakers with federal agency insignia emblazoned on the back stormed through the main entrance. The sheer force of their presence caused the rioting crowd of billionaires and hedge fund managers to instantly part like the Red Sea. The lead agent did not pause to admire the indoor waterfalls or the imported orchids. He marched straight toward the stage, flanked by armed officers, his eyes locked dead on Elijah. Elijah threw his hands up in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender before the agents even reached him. Alyssa, who had been weeping hysterically on the stage floor, suddenly scrambled away from her husband as if he were highly radioactive. When the lead agent grabbed Elijah's arms and slammed them behind his back, reading him his rights over the din of the panicked crowd, Alyssa did not defend him. She screamed at him, slapping at his shoulders, cursing him for ruining her life and stripping away her luxury status. She was furious not that he was a criminal, but that he had been caught. Thomas watched the federal agents drag his golden son-in-law down the center aisle and out toward the flashing police cruisers. The reality of his absolute, inescapable ruin finally snapped the last remaining thread of his sanity. He tore himself away from the security guards, pinning him against the wall, his face a terrifying mask of purple rage. He charged toward the front of the ballroom, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at me. "You have destroyed me!" Thomas screamed, his voice tearing through the cavernous atrium, raw and completely unhinged. "My logistics company is tied to his fund. You have made us homeless. You did this to your own family." I looked down from the elevated stage at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel incredibly small. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering childhood guilt. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, surgical clarity. He was still trying to blame me for his own catastrophic failures. He still believed he was entitled to my money, my grandmother's trust, to cover his massive mistakes. "No, Dad," I replied, my voice projecting through the sovereign sound system, cutting effortlessly through his hysteria. "You ruined yourself. You secretly mortgaged our family home and your entire company to fund a scam just so you could pretend to be richer than you actually are." The ultra-wealthy investors surrounding him murmured in disgust, stepping back to leave him standing alone in a circle of judgment. Thomas had spent 20 years building that logistics company, constantly reminding me that I was entirely unfit to inherit it because I lacked his ruthless business acumen. Yet he had risked every single asset he owned, leveraged his entire legacy solely to buy his way into the upper echelons of society alongside his fraudulent son-in-law. He wanted the prestige of a billionaire in the family so desperately that he ignored every red flag, every warning sign, and every basic rule of financial due diligence. He had traded a lifetime of steady, practical work for a handful of imaginary magic beans. Caroline rushed forward, grabbing Thomas's arm. Her borrowed diamond necklaces caught the harsh glare of the police lights reflecting off the glass walls. "Tessa, please," she begged, her voice shrill with manufactured panic. She looked around at the judgmental faces of Boston's elite, desperate to salvage any shred of her social standing. "We are your parents. Family protects family. You have the resources to help us fix this. You have to save us." I stared at my mother, marveling at her endless capacity for delusion. She had spent my entire adolescence hiding me away, treating my teenage pregnancy like a disease that would infect her pristine country club reputation. Now, completely stripped of her wealth and cornered by federal authorities, she was trying to play the devoted, loving mother. "Family protects family," I echoed the microphone, picking up the sharp, unforgiving edge in my tone. "Is that why you sent a courier to my office today? Is that why you threatened to call Child Protective Services and fabricate abuse allegations to have my daughter ripped from my home? Was that your version of protecting family, Caroline? You thought you could weaponize my child to steal my inheritance, and now you have the audacity to stand in my building and demand my help." Caroline recoiled as if I had physically struck her in the face. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes darting frantically toward the crowd. The elite guests, including the politicians and socialites she had spent years trying to impress, looked at her with absolute revulsion. Threatening a child was a line no one in that room was willing to cross. My parents were completely socially isolated. They were instantaneous pariahs. Thomas grabbed the edge of the stage, his knuckles white spit flying from his lips. "I will take you to court," he snarled, spitting the words through clenched teeth. "I will sue you for everything you own. You owe me for raising you. I will take this building. I will take your company." I smiled, a slow, predatory expression that finally made Thomas step back. I turned my attention away from his empty threats and signaled to David, my vice president of operations, who was standing quietly by the side of the stage. He stepped forward, his face a mask of total professional indifference, and handed me a thick manila folder. I tapped the microphone, ensuring the entire room was listening to my final decree. "When the bank foreclosed on your loans yesterday, I announced, my voice echoing with absolute finality, an anonymous holding company purchased all your debt. Every defaulted mortgage, every leveraged corporate loan, every seized asset you pledged to Elijah's fake crypto fund." I opened the manila folder and pulled out the crisp, legally binding deeds and foreclosure notices. I held them up, looking directly into my father's horrified eyes. "That company is mine. You do not own a home. You do not own a company. You are officially my evicted tenants." The words slammed into the room with the force of a physical blow. The absolute finality of the eviction notice hung in the air, a death sentence for the Thorne legacy. Thomas collapsed to his knees right there in the center aisle, his expensive tuxedo crumpling as he buried his face in his hands. He let out a hollow, agonizing sound that was entirely devoid of his usual arrogance. Caroline fell beside him, her weeping echoing through the cavernous space. But Alyssa could not process the defeat. Her brain violently rejected the reality unfolding around her. Her entire identity, her unquestioned status as the golden child, her absolute superiority, all of it was being obliterated in front of the very people she worshipped. She let out an unearthly, guttural shriek. The elegant, poised socialite vanished in an instant, replaced by a frantic, rabid animal cornered in a trap. She lunged at me, her hands curled into claws, aiming right for my face with blinding speed. I did not even flinch. I simply shifted my weight and smoothly sidestepped her. Her momentum carried her forward, her arms flailing wildly in the empty air. She tripped over the hem of her heavy sequined crimson gown, crashing hard onto the polished wooden floor of the stage. The sickening thud of her knees hitting the wood echoed through the microphone still in my hand. She scrambled to her knees, her perfectly styled hair falling in ragged, sweat-soaked strands across her face. "It is not fair!" Alyssa screamed, tears of pure venomous rage streaming down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She pounded her fists against the stage floor, completely unhinged. "You are just a college dropout. You got pregnant at 18 and ruined your life. You are an embarrassing, pathetic mistake. I did everything right. I have a master's degree. I am the perfect daughter. You do not deserve any of this." I looked down at her, my expression carved from solid ice. I stepped closer, looking down at the pathetic display of entitlement, ensuring the microphone picked up every single syllable I was about to deliver. "A degree you paid for by stealing the college fund Grandma left for me. Alyssa," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterics with surgical precision. "You thought I never knew where that money went. You drained the account the exact month Thomas and Caroline kicked me out of the house. I built an international empire from the ground up, bleeding for every single asset I own. Meanwhile, you built a TikTok following bought with fake bots and Elijah's stolen money." I watched her eyes widen in absolute horror as the truth hit the airwaves. For years, she had paraded around the internet as a brilliant, educated, self-made influencer. She had given lengthy, self-congratulatory interviews to lifestyle magazines about her arduous academic journey and her organic, inspirational rise to social media stardom. Now, the city's most elite circle was watching her entire carefully constructed narrative disintegrate in real time. The wealthy guests in the front row, the same people she had been desperately trying to charm just an hour ago, were whispering to each other, their faces contorted in undisguised disgust. Worse for Alyssa, they all had their phones out. The gala was being live-streamed. Alyssa had insisted on it, hiring a professional media crew with high-definition cameras mounted on tripods around the room to broadcast her grand philanthropic triumph to her millions of followers. She had literally paid to orchestrate and broadcast her own public execution to the entire world. "Liar," Alyssa wailed, her voice cracking as she scrambled backward on the stage, trying to get away from me. "You are lying. Everyone knows you are insane. Elijah is a genius, and I earned my followers. I am an ambassador for global luxury brands. I am a star." She looked frantically toward the center aisle, begging for our parents to defend her. But Thomas was still weeping on the floor, completely broken. Caroline refused to look up, utterly humiliated. For the first time in her pampered life, Alyssa had absolutely no one to hide behind. She was entirely exposed, her toxic vanity and fraudulent existence laid bare under the bright stage lights. "There is no one left to lie to, Alyssa," I stated coldly, my voice ringing out over the murmuring crowd. "The federal agents dragging your husband away right now are currently seizing his servers. Every fraudulent wire transfer, every fake account purchase, every dime of stolen investor capital used to buy your designer bags and fund your sponsored trips to Dubai is being entered into federal evidence as we speak. You are not a luxury ambassador. You are a beneficiary of wire fraud." At that exact moment, the sequined clutch sitting on the acrylic podium began to vibrate violently. It was Alyssa's phone. The buzzing was loud, continuous, and relentless, vibrating harshly against the hard plastic of the podium and cutting through the heavy silence of the room. Alyssa scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking so badly she could barely open the golden clasp of her purse. She pulled out her phone, the bright screen lighting up her pale, tear-streaked face. I watched as her eyes darted across the notifications, her pupils dilating in sheer, unadulterated terror. The live stream had done its job with lethal efficiency. Her management agency was calling repeatedly, the missed calls stacking up by the second. Emails were flooding her inbox in a cascading waterfall of total destruction. A major French fashion house had sent a termination of contract notice. A premium cosmetics brand emailed a formal cancellation of her upcoming holiday campaign. A luxury travel company abruptly withdrew their sponsorship. One by one, in real time, the brands that funded her lavish lifestyle were watching the catastrophic gala unfold on the live broadcasts and severing all ties. Her inbox was a graveyard of cancellations. Alyssa stood frozen on the stage, the glowing screen of her phone reflecting the absolute, undeniable end of her reign. The deafening wail of sirens outside abruptly cut off, replaced by the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots echoing through the marble corridor. The grand double doors of the ballroom flew open with bone-rattling force. Federal agents and local police breached the gala doors, pouring into the room in a disciplined, terrifying wave. Dark windbreakers stamped with FBI and SEC insignia contrasted sharply against the glittering sea of haute couture. The remaining investors, billionaires who usually dictated the terms of every room they entered, scrambled backward in sheer panic. They parted like a terrified flock of sheep, clearing a wide, unobstructed path. The lead agent, a tall woman, with steel gray hair and an expression carved from granite, did not hesitate. She marched straight for the stage, her eyes locked directly on her primary target. Elijah snapped out of his shock. Pure animalistic terror hijacked his nervous system. He spun around, abandoning his weeping wife, and sprinted toward the heavy velvet curtains, concealing the service exit at the rear of the stage. He moved with the frantic, uncoordinated desperation of a cornered rat, completely forgetting whose building he was in. He did not even make it 3 steps. My head of security stepped through the curtains, a massive wall of muscle blocking the only escape route. The guard did not say a word. He simply planted a solid hand squarely in the center of Elijah's chest and shoved. The impact sent Elijah stumbling backward. He lost his footing on the polished wood and crashed violently into a towering catering table. Champagne flutes, crystal bowls, and silver platters cascaded onto the floor in a spectacular shower of shattered glass and ruined hors d'oeuvres. Before Elijah could untangle himself from the wreckage, the federal agents were on him. 2 officers hauled him to his feet by the collar of his ruined tuxedo. He was thrown against the remaining surface of the table, his face smashed against the white linen. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs, snapping around his wrists, echoed sharply through the room. Elijah Thorne, the lead agent, announced, her voice booming across the silent ballroom. "You are under arrest for massive wire fraud and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Elijah writhed against the table, sobbing openly, begging anyone in the crowd to call his lawyer. The investors only glared at him with absolute contempt, some raising their phones to record his pathetic downfall. The lead agent turned her attention to the back of the room where Thomas stood paralyzed against the wall. 2 more agents marched briskly toward him. Thomas tried to straighten his posture, desperately attempting to summon the arrogant, untouchable patriarch he had played for decades. He adjusted his silk tie with shaking hands, clearing his throat as the agents approached. "There has been a massive misunderstanding," Thomas stammered, attempting to project his usual boardroom authority. "I am Thomas Lux. I am a prominent business owner in this city. I demand to speak to the agent in charge. I am a victim here." The agents did not slow their pace. One of them pulled a folded document from his jacket. "Thomas Lux," the agent stated coldly. "You are also detained for questioning regarding your complicity in the financial fraud. Bank records indicate you knowingly leveraged fraudulent assets to secure personal corporate loans. Put your hands behind your back, sir." "No." Thomas gasped, the last remaining trace of color draining from his face. "You cannot do this. I built an empire. I am a respected man." He did not resist. He simply deflated. The imposing, terrifying figure who had dictated every aspect of my childhood, who had banished me for tarnishing his pristine reputation, crumbled instantly. He looked like a deflated, broken old man as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. His knees buckled slightly, and the agents had to hold him up by his elbows as they marched him down the center aisle, parading him in front of the very society he had sacrificed everything to impress. Caroline watched her husband being hauled away like a common thief. She looked at Elijah, pinned against the table, blubbering incoherently, while agents searched his pockets. She looked at Alyssa, who was staring blankly at the floor, completely catatonic as her digital empire burned to ash. The reality of the last 10 minutes finally pierced through Caroline's lifelong veil of denial. The absolute scale of the devastation struck her with physical force. She realized she had lost her husband, her golden son-in-law, her home, and her social standing all in 10 minutes. Her wealthy husband was facing a federal indictment. Her golden son-in-law was a disgraced criminal. Her majestic suburban mansion belonged to the daughter she had thrown away. Her precious social standing, the only currency she had ever truly valued, was obliterated forever. Every camera in the room, every smartphone held by the elite guests, the professional media crew Alyssa had hired, all of them were currently broadcasting her absolute ruin to the entire world. A strange, high-pitched keening sound escaped Caroline's throat. It grew louder, morphing into a raw, hysterical wail of pure agony. She stumbled forward, her designer heels catching on the carpet. She fell to her knees right on the stage. She did not try to stand back up. Instead, she crawled. She crawled across the polished wood tears, pouring down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive cosmetics. She reached me, her hands trembling violently as she threw herself forward. She clutched the hem of my midnight blue designer gown, gripping the expensive silk in her fists, like a drowning woman clinging to a lifeline. "Tessa, please," Caroline sobbed, burying her face against my legs, weeping with a chaotic, unhinged hysteria right in front of the flashing cameras. "Please do not let them do this. We are your family. I am your mother. You have to save us. Please, Tessa. I am begging you. Save us." I stared down at the top of Caroline's perfectly styled hair, now disheveled and plastered to her damp forehead. Her manicured fingers clawed at the midnight blue silk of my gown, wrinkling the expensive fabric in her desperate, sweaty grip. The woman who had spent my entire life curating an image of untouchable glacial elegance was now sobbing into my shins like a frightened toddler. "Tessa, my baby!" Caroline wailed, her voice cracking as she strained to look up at me. Thick black rivers of ruined mascara ran down her cheeks, staining her expensive foundation. "Please, we are blood. You have to bail your father out. You have to let us stay in the house. We will give you the master suite, we will do anything. You cannot do this to your family." The sheer audacity of her bargain was staggering. She was offering me the master suite in a house I already owned entirely. She was offering me a room in a mansion she had actively banished me from a decade ago, and calling me her baby. The last time she had called me that was right before she handed me a trash bag and told me to pack my belongings because a teenage pregnancy did not fit the pristine luxe family aesthetic. The elite guests, the very people Caroline had spent her entire life trying to impress, stood in a wide circle around us on the ballroom floor. Their phones were still raised, recording every pathetic sob and frantic plea. The silence in the massive atrium was absolute, broken only by the sharp clicks of handcuffs at the back of the room and Caroline's hysterical gasping. I did not reach down to comfort her. I did not offer her a tissue. I looked at the woman who had tormented me for a decade, my expression completely devoid of mercy. "It was your father, Tessa!" Caroline babbled, her voice climbing to a frantic shrill pitch as she tried to shift the blame. "Thomas made me do it. He forced me to agree to the plan with Elijah. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you. You are my daughter. You have to believe me." "Do not lie to me, Caroline," I said, my voice ringing out with terrifying absolute calm. "I saw the courier receipts. I read the legal affidavits you signed this morning. You were not a passive victim in Thomas's scheme. You were the architect." She flinched as if I had struck her. Her hands shook violently against my dress, but she refused to let go, clinging to me as the last remaining vestige of her wealth and status. "You made my 7-year-old daughter sleep on a freezing marble floor because a dog needed a mattress," I stated, projecting my voice so every single investor and socialite in the room could hear exactly who this woman was. Caroline's eyes widened in horror. She shook her head frantically, trying to deny the memory, trying to formulate a defense, but I did not let her breathe. "When I came to you for help during a blizzard 3 years ago," I continued, my words landing like heavy stones in the quiet room. "My heat had been shut off and Lily had a fever. I begged you for one night in your guest room. Instead, you locked us in the unheated foyer. You gave Alyssa's purebred spaniel a heated orthopedic bed by the fireplace, and you told me my daughter was lucky to have a roof over her head at all. You watched a sick child shiver on stone tiles while you sat in the next room drinking vintage wine." The surrounding crowd muttered in absolute revulsion. Even the most cutthroat venture capitalists in the room looked physically sickened. Threatening a business rival was one thing, but torturing a sick child was a line no one in that room was willing to cross. Caroline had just suffered a total social death. She was an instantaneous pariah. No country club would ever accept her membership again. No charity board would ever allow her to sit at their tables. She was completely, irreparably ruined. "I was trying to teach you a lesson about responsibility." Caroline choked out a pathetic, desperate attempt to justify her cruelty. "I was trying to make you strong." "You were trying to break me," I corrected coldly. "But you failed. And today, when you realized I was not broken, You decided to steal my child. You called my daughter a mistake. You conspired with Thomas and Elijah to fabricate abuse allegations. You tried to use federal authorities to take her from me to throw her into the foster system just so you could blackmail me for my holding company's assets. Caroline's mouth opened, but only a pathetic, breathless wheeze came out. The realization that I knew every detail of their morning conspiracy finally crushed whatever fight she had left in her. She slumped forward, her forehead resting against my shoes, weeping with loud, ugly sounds of absolute defeat. I looked past her to the back of the room. The federal agents were marching Thomas and Elijah through the grand double doors, leading them out into the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting police cruisers. The empire they had tried to build on a foundation of lies and stolen money was gone. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I grabbed the heavy silk of my dress and forcefully yanked it out of her grasp. She fell forward slightly, her palms slapping against the hard wooden stage. "I am not bailing anyone out," I said, my voice echoing with absolute uncompromising finality. "Your eviction notice is effective in 30 days. Be out by the 1st of the month." Caroline's sobbing echoed through the cavernous silent ballroom, a pathetic soundtrack to the total destruction of the Lux legacy. I watched my mother's hands slowly slide off the silk of my gown, her spirit entirely broken, as she collapsed onto the floor in a heap of defeated misery. Beside her, the shock finally began to wear off Alyssa. The federal agents had just marched her husband out the front door, and with him went her credit cards, her bank accounts, and her entire fraudulent existence. The asset freeze would be instantaneous and absolute. She was now the wife of a federal criminal facing mountains of legal debt and a lifetime of very public disgrace. Alyssa's pristine, camera-ready posture collapsed. The glittering, untouchable socialite vanished, replaced by a terrified, destitute woman who suddenly realized she possessed absolutely no ability to survive in the real world. Her knees gave out. She dropped to the polished wooden floor right beside our weeping mother. The heavy sequins of her crimson gown pooled around her in a puddle of dark red, looking like spilled blood under the harsh, unforgiving stage lights. "Tessa." Alyssa whispered, her voice trembling so violently it was barely recognizable. She looked up at me, her face pale, her perfect makeup smeared with sweat and fresh tears. The suffocating arrogance that had defined every interaction we ever had was completely eradicated. "Tessa, please? You have to help me." I stared down at her, my expression an impenetrable mask carved from ice. The silence in the ballroom stretched out heavy and absolute as hundreds of the city's most powerful people watched the golden child grovel. "I have nothing." Alyssa choked out her voice, rising in panic as she realized I was not going to immediately offer her salvation. "Elijah's accounts are gone. The feds will seize everything. The house, the cars, the jewelry. I am going to be buried in his legal debts. My sponsors just dropped me on live television. My agency dropped me. I am ruined. I have absolutely nothing left." She scrambled forward on her knees, reaching out but stopping just short of touching my dress, perhaps remembering how violently I had pulled away from Caroline. "I do not know how to do anything," Alyssa wailed, the shameful admission tearing from her throat. "I have no real-world skills. I cannot pay for lawyers. I cannot buy food. I have never worked a real day in my life. You have a massive company, Tessa. You are a CEO. You have thousands of employees across the globe. Please, I am begging you. Give me a job. Let me work for you. I will do anything you ask. Just do not let me starve in the street." I looked at the woman who had spent a decade mocking my poverty. The sister who had laughed when I was thrown out onto the street, pregnant and terrified. The influencer who had built a lucrative career pretending to be a brilliant self-made genius while funding her luxury lifestyle with stolen money from her husband's victims. My eyes drifted past her tear-streaked face and caught movement near the service entrance at the side of the stage. A venue janitor, an older man in a gray uniform, stood frozen near his maintenance cart, his eyes wide as he watched the billionaire drama unfold from the shadows. "Excuse me?" I called out, my voice cutting cleanly through Alyssa's hysterical sobbing. The janitor jumped, slightly startled to be addressed. "Yes, you." Bring me that mop, please. The entire ballroom held its breath. The janitor, looking utterly bewildered, slowly pushed his cart forward out of the shadows. He detached the heavy industrial string mop from its holder and handed it up to me over the edge of the stage. I took the wooden handle, feeling its rough, splintered texture against my palms. I did not break eye contact with Alyssa. I turned the mop over and dropped it. The heavy, wet strings hit the stage floor with a sickening smack, landing directly on the hem of Alyssa's $10,000 crimson gown. Dirty, soapy water splashed against her bare knees and soaked into the expensive silk. Alyssa flinched, staring at the mop as if it were a venomous snake. She slowly raised her eyes back to mine, her breath hitching in her throat, her chest heaving with silent sobs. "We are currently hiring night shift cleaners for our downtown commercial properties," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear across the silent venue, ensuring every microphone caught the offer. "The pay is minimum wage. You get one 15-minute break per shift. You will be scrubbing toilets, emptying trash cans, and mopping floors until dawn. If you want the position, submit your resume through the public portal like everyone else. We do not do nepotism here." Alyssa stared at me in absolute, horrified disbelief. The reality of the dirty mop lying on her expensive dress, the reality of minimum wage, the reality of cleaning toilets finally shattered the very last piece of her fragile sanity. She let out a guttural, agonizing scream. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire universe burn to the ground. Beside her, Caroline resumed her hysterical wailing, wrapping her arms around her ruined golden child. They clung to each other on the stage floor, a tangled, pathetic mess of ruined designer fabric, smeared makeup, and shattered egos. I did not waste another second looking at them. They were no longer my family. They were ghosts of a past I had completely conquered. I turned my back on the screaming, broken women on the stage. I walked deliberately toward the stairs. My posture was perfectly straight, my steps measured and unhurried. As I descended the velvet-lined steps, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted entirely. The sea of ultra-wealthy investors. The same people who had sneered at me an hour ago. The same billionaires who had treated me like an uninvited interloper now moved with frantic urgency. They parted instantly, creating a wide, unobstructed path down the center aisle. No one dared to meet my eyes directly. No one dared to whisper a single insult or judgment. They looked at me with newfound, undisguised reverence. I had not just defeated Thomas Lux. I had dismantled his entire dynasty, exposed a federal crime, seized his assets, and destroyed his legacy without breaking a sweat. In their eyes, I was no longer the outcast daughter. I was an absolute apex predator. I heard the hushed murmurs rippling through the crowd as I passed. They were whispering my name, analyzing the ruthless efficiency of my takeover, calculating just how much power I now wielded in their world. Men in tailored suits bowed their heads slightly as I walked by. Women in diamond necklaces stepped back, giving me a wide berth. I walked down the length of the grand ballroom, the sounds of my mother and sister sobbing on the stage fading behind me. I pushed open the heavy oak doors at the entrance and stepped out into the cool, crisp night air of the city. I breathed in deeply, filling my lungs with the scent of rain and absolute victory. I walked down the stone steps of the gala venue entirely alone and completely untouchable. 6 months passed with the rapid cleansing force of a wildfire. The dust finally settled over the smoldering crater of the Lux family empire, leaving behind a barren landscape of public disgrace, seized assets, and federal indictments. The universe, it seemed, had a perfect sense of absolute justice. Elijah Thorne did not charm his way out of a federal courtroom. The judge handed down a 15-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary, a brutal reality that completely broke the former golden boy. He traded his bespoke Italian tuxedos and imported leather shoes for an oversized, scratchy orange jumpsuit and cheap plastic sandals. The man who once commanded elite boardrooms and sipped vintage champagne now adhered to a rigid, terrifying schedule dictated by harsh electronic buzzers and unblinking fluorescent lights. He lost his wealth, his freedom, and his completely unearned arrogance. In a prison environment where white-collar criminals sat at the absolute bottom of the food chain, Elijah quickly learned what it meant to be utterly powerless. Thomas Lux fared no better. He miraculously avoided a prison sentence by cooperating with federal investigators and throwing Elijah completely under the bus, but his freedom came at an agonizing cost. The government seized his corporate holdings, his offshore accounts, and the grand suburban mansion he had prioritized over his own flesh and blood. Stripped of his empire, Thomas now wore a stiff red vest over a cheap polo shirt, a plastic name tag pinned to his chest. The once untouchable titan of industry was working as a cashier at a local hardware store. Every day he scanned barcodes and bagged screws for minimum wage, his hands trembling with suppressed humiliation whenever former business associates walked through his checkout lane and recognized the broken man behind the register. Every single paycheck he earned was aggressively garnished to pay off his mounting insurmountable IRS debts. He returned every evening to a cramped, dilapidated one-bedroom apartment that constantly smelled of boiled cabbage and damp carpet. Caroline sat waiting for him on a stained, second-hand sofa, staring blankly at a small television that only picked up local broadcast channels. Her extensive designer wardrobe had been auctioned off by federal liquidators to cover their soaring legal fees. She now wore cheap synthetic fabrics that irritated her pampered skin. Stripped of her country club memberships, her charity galas, and her entire social circle, Caroline existed in a state of perpetual, suffocating misery. She spent her days mourning the ghost of her social life, drowning in the exact reality of poverty she had always despised and mocked me for enduring. Alyssa suffered the most brutal fall from grace. The internet, notoriously unforgiving, moved on with ruthless speed. Her digital footprint was scrubbed completely clean. Major platforms banned her accounts for violating terms of service regarding fraudulent financial activity. She lost her verified checkmark, her millions of artificially inflated followers, and her meticulously curated, entirely fake identity. Now she sat under the flickering, migraine-inducing lights of a windowless corporate call center. A cheap headset was strapped over her unkempt, unstyled hair. The brilliant self-made influencer was working a menial data entry and customer service job for $14 an hour. She spent 8 hours a day apologizing to angry customers over the phone, a profoundly poetic punishment for a woman who had spent her entire existence demanding to speak to the manager. Her hands, once perfectly manicured for luxury product placements, were now calloused and dry from cheap office soap and endless repetitive typing. Far removed from their squalor and despair, my world was bathed in brilliant, undisturbed light. The private elevator doors slid open smoothly, revealing the expansive, sunlit foyer of my new penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows wrapped around the entire perimeter, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the city I now held firmly in the palm of my hand. The space was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring rich mahogany floors, custom minimalist furniture, and the quiet, undeniable hum of a perfectly orchestrated life. I sat behind a massive desk carved from a single slab of black marble. The morning sun illuminated the thick stack of legal documents resting on the pristine surface. I picked up a solid gold fountain pen and signed my name on the final designated line. It was done. I had just finalized the paperwork establishing an ironclad multi-million-dollar trust fund for my daughter. The legal structure was entirely bulletproof, engineered with the exact same ruthless precision I had used to dismantle my parents' fraudulent empire. This trust guaranteed that Abby would never face a single day of financial insecurity. She would never have to beg for a safe place to sleep. She would never have to endure the freezing cold of a marble floor while a dog slept on a heated bed. She would never have to rely on the conditional toxic love of manipulative people just to survive. Her future was entirely secured, locked away safely in an untouchable fortress of generational wealth that I had bled to build from the ground up. I heard the soft, familiar pitter-patter of bare feet against the hardwood floor. 7-year-old Abby walked into the office, rubbing the last remnants of sleep from her eyes. She wore a pair of cozy silk pajamas, holding her favorite stuffed animal tightly against her chest. Good morning, Mommy, she mumbled, reaching her arms up toward me. Good morning, my love, I replied, a genuine, profound smile breaking across my face. I set the gold pen down and scooped her up into my arms, holding her securely against my hip. Let us go look at the city. I carried her out through the sliding glass doors and onto the expansive wraparound balcony. The crisp morning air was incredibly refreshing. We stood together at the glass railing watching the sunrise slowly paint the towering city skyline in brilliant, vibrant shades of gold, amber, and violet. The warmth of the rising sun washed over our faces, bringing with it a profound sense of absolute peace. As I held my daughter safe in my arms, looking out over the world, I had conquered the ultimate truth, finally settled into my bones. The revenge at the gala had been deeply satisfying. Watching the people who abused me face the severe natural consequences of their own cruelty was a necessary closing of a very dark chapter. But the absolute sweetest revenge was not the destruction of their fake empire. It was the creation of this reality. It was building a beautiful, unbreakable kingdom of our own, a fortress where no one could ever hurt us, manipulate us, or cast us aside again. A life built entirely on truth, resilience, and unconditional love. We stood there together as the city woke up below us, entirely safe, completely secure, and infinitely powerful.